The river flowed slowly that afternoon, its dark surface trembling in the evening light. Ethan stood before his mother's old cabin on the riverbank. Small, old, and quiet, a silence that seemed familiar to him. He hadn't been here since the funeral. The air inside still smelled of cedar and long forgotten winters. He set down his duffel bag, dusted off the old rocking chair, and for the first time in years, let himself stand still. Behind him, Hunter, his loyal German shepherd, hesitated in the doorway, tail down, ears cocked forward. Then suddenly, the dog began to dig. The sound of claws scraping the floor broke the silence. Sharp, urgent, insistent. "Calm down, kid," Ethan muttered, but Hunter didn't stop. The sound continued to echo through the empty cabin, until something shifted beneath the wood. A faint earthy scent wafted through the cracks, and with it, something colder, something out of place. Ethan knelt, his breath trembling. The boards scraped as his hands brushed away the dust. And in that silence, he knew whatever lay beneath those boards would change everything he thought he knew about his family and himself. Support us by subscribing. The wind over Lake Superior carried the taste of iron and snow, biting through the early evening like a memory that refused to fade. Daniel Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup, the heater barely working as frost gathered along the corners of the windshield. 10 years since he'd left Duluth, and everything looked both smaller and colder, like time had shrunk the town but left its silence untouched. Daniel was 40 now, his face carved with the kind of lines that came from sandstorms, not smiles. His hair, once black, had turned the color of weathered ash. A faint scar ran along his jaw, the legacy of a roadside blast in Helmand Province. He didn't talk about it, not anymore. There were too many things he had stopped talking about. Beside him, Ranger sat upright on the torn passenger seat. The dog was 8 years old now, his thick gray and black coat dulled slightly by time, but his amber eyes sharp as ever. He wasn't just a dog to Daniel, he was the last living witness of a decade spent in places where daylight was a rumor. Ranger had the posture of an animal that understood silence, every muscle tuned to his owner's smallest motion. When the truck slowed to turn off the main road, the shepherd's ears pricked. He remembered too. The old house stood at the edge of the bluff, its wooden frame leaning slightly toward the lake as though bracing against the wind. Paint had peeled down to bare pine, and the windows reflected nothing but gray sky. Daniel parked beside the snow-dusted porch and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, fingers resting on the ignition, his breath fogging the glass. The place looked smaller, lonelier. Maybe it always had been. He stepped out, boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The air was thick with the smell of pine and the metallic hint of snow about to fall. His mother's wind chime still hung by the door, a cluster of shells she'd collected on a trip to the East Coast 30 years ago. It clinked weakly, a sound too soft for this kind of cold. Daniel reached up and touched it, the gesture half habit, half prayer. Ranger trotted ahead, nose low to the ground, tail sweeping in slow arcs. He paused at the front step, looked back, then whined softly. Daniel gave a small nod, the kind soldiers used when words weren't worth the air. "Yeah, I know, buddy. We're home." Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and dust. The furniture was covered with white sheets, as if the house itself had been trying to forget the people who once lived in it. Daniel dropped his duffel bag near the couch, exhaling as if he'd been holding his breath since crossing the city line. His mother had passed the winter before, alone, found by a neighbor after 3 days of unanswered calls. Sarah, Mrs. Sarah Milton, had been that neighbor. Sarah appeared at the door, just as Daniel was removing his gloves. She was in her late 50s, tall and slim, with silver-streaked auburn hair tied back in a loose braid. Her face carried the warmth of someone who'd lived her entire life among storms, but never let them harden her. She wore a green wool coat that looked older than Daniel's truck. "You made it back," she said softly, her voice carrying both relief and something heavier. Pity, perhaps. Daniel forced a small smile. "Didn't think I'd get this far without freezing." Sarah stepped in, brushing snow from her boots. "Your mother talked about you every time I brought her soup. She kept that picture of you and Ranger on the shelf by the stove." "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "She never threw anything away." Sarah's gaze softened. "She was proud of you, you know." He didn't answer. Pride had been a foreign language since Afghanistan. Ranger brushed against his leg, grounding him, reminding him that at least one living creature didn't expect words. Sarah looked around the dim room, then sighed. This house needs more than a good fire. I'll bring you some groceries tomorrow. Heat works? Daniel nodded. Mostly. Well, if it doesn't, you know where I live? She turned toward the door, hesitating. It's good you're back, Daniel. She'd have wanted that. After she left, silence settled again, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs. Daniel lit the old iron stove, watching as the flames caught and the shadows stretched across the walls. He sat for a long time, elbows on his knees, staring at the fire. The sound of wind outside blended with the faint ticking of the stove metal, expanding in heat. Ranger paced slowly, sniffing corners as if cataloging ghosts. When he reached the far side of the living room, he stopped. Ears up, tail stiff. He stared at the floorboards near the vent that led to the crawl space beneath the house. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Daniel frowned. Probably a mouse. But Ranger didn't move. He began to scratch, claws clicking against the wood, then barked sharply, once, twice, in that clipped way he used to alert during patrols overseas. Daniel knelt beside him, his hand resting on the dog's back. Easy, Ranger, there's nothing. A sound interrupted him, a faint metallic clang from beneath the floor. Not a pipe, not a mouse. It was deliberate, slow, rhythmic, like someone striking metal with a hammer in reply. Ranger's growl deepened. Daniel froze, breath caught halfway in his chest. The house creaked in the wind, but that other sound, steady, measured, continued from below. He reached for the flashlight on the counter, thumb trembling against the switch. "Stay close, boy," he whispered. The beam cut through the dark, tracing the outlines of furniture, the narrow seam in the floor where cold air seeped through. The noise came again, 3 sharp knocks, then silence. Daniel stared at the floor, his pulse loud in his ears. The lake wind howled outside, but the sound beneath the boards was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was down there. The morning came slow and gray over Lake Superior. Snow had fallen through the night, smoothing every edge of the old house into soft, white silence. Daniel Hayes woke before sunrise, still dressed in the same clothes from the night before. The fire had died down to pale embers, and Ranger slept curled beside the stove, one ear twitching now and then, as if listening to dreams. For a long moment, Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the floorboards that had knocked back at him hours earlier. His rational mind said it was nothing. Wind, old pipes, a trick of memory. But the soldier in him knew rhythm when he heard it. That had been deliberate. He rubbed his face, sighed, and stood. The cold hit him immediately as he opened the back door. The world outside was washed in white. The lake, half frozen, stretched into the distance under a dull gray sky. Duluth was quiet in winter, always had been, but this silence felt different, thick, waiting. He tossed another log into the stove and started to check the vents, trying to find whatever had made that sound. Ranger followed, nose to the floor, tail sweeping slow. The vent near the living room corner was loose. Daniel knelt, fingers numb as he unscrewed the rusted cover. A wave of dust spilled out, followed by something metallic. A small tin box, edges corroded, the lid nearly fused shut. He pulled it free and brushed it off. It was heavier than it looked, its weight uneven. The initials scratched faintly into the lid read H.L. He frowned. His mother's initials had been M.H., Mary Hayes. He pried it open with his pocket knife. Inside lay several folded letters, brittle and yellowed, tied with a string that had long since lost its color. The paper smelled faintly of salt and iron. The handwriting was neat but pressed hard into the page, the kind of writing born of urgency. He untied the bundle and read the first one. "Mary, I can still hear them at night. The waves don't break the same anymore. There are lights out there when the fog rolls in, and the harbor men whisper that the lake has taken another ship. They say some things don't sink. They wait. If you see the glow, don't go near the shore. H.L." Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath trembling. His mother had never mentioned anyone by those initials. He flipped through the rest, 8 letters in total, each one stranger than the last. They spoke of ships that vanished but called home, and of voices below the ice. The last one ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. Ranger nudged Daniel's arm, tail lowered. The dog's gaze was fixed on the window overlooking the lake. Outside, the light had shifted. Paler now, the sun trying to push through the clouds. Daniel slipped the letters back into the box and set it on the table. Whoever H.L. was, his mother had hidden the box carefully, maybe too carefully. He made coffee, the bitter scent filling the room, then glanced at the framed photograph on the mantel, his mother standing beside the old lighthouse keeper from the next inlet years ago. He remembered the man faintly. Harold Linton, tall and broad-shouldered, with wind-chapped skin and a beard like snow. He'd lived in the red-roofed lighthouse a few miles downshore until it was decommissioned. The town used to call him Harold the Keeper, but Daniel recalled whispers when he was a kid. Stories of the man who refused to leave the light even after it was shut down. Could HL be Harold Linton? By noon, the wind had picked up again, scattering thin flakes across the frozen yard. Daniel layered on his coat and stepped outside. Ranger trotted beside him, paws sinking into the snow. He walked to the edge of the bluff where the land met the frozen lake. The air smelled of steel and pine sap. The lighthouse was barely visible through the haze, a pale silhouette against the sky. His mother used to take him there on summer evenings to watch the light spin across the water. Now the tower stood dead, its glass eye clouded with frost. He felt the letters heavy in his pocket. "Don't go near the shore when the light glows," the note had said. He shook his head, forcing a bitter laugh. He'd survived war. He wasn't about to be spooked by ghost stories. That night, the wind rose again. Snow whispered against the windows, and the lake moaned under the ice. Daniel sat by the fire, reading through his mother's old journal, searching for any mention of HL or the lighthouse. There was nothing, only entries about the weather, the neighbors, the endless repairs this house demanded, but at the bottom of one page, half faded, was a single sentence. "He said the lake remembers." Ranger stirred suddenly, ears sharp. The dog stood, facing the window, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Daniel followed his gaze. Outside, beyond the frozen porch rail, the lake shimmered faintly. A band of pale blue light rippled across the ice, stretching from the shore toward the horizon like a heartbeat. It flickered, pulsed, then faded. Daniel stood, heart pounding. "Just reflection," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. Ranger barked once, loud, sharp, then pressed close to the door, hackles up. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The cold slammed into him. The air was still, but his breath came out in fast clouds. Down by the water, where the ice met the rocks, something glittered, small, metallic, like the flash of a mirror beneath the snow. He started down the slope, boots sliding. Ranger followed close, silent now. The glow vanished before he reached it. Only the dark sheen of frozen lake remained, smooth and endless. He crouched, brushing the snow aside. Nothing but ice. He looked out toward the horizon, where the last trace of light shimmered and went out. Ranger whined, pressing against his leg. Daniel stood there, wind tugging at his coat, staring at the place where the light had been. For a brief second, he thought he heard something, a faint hum beneath the ice, rhythmic and distant, almost like a voice. He took a step back, forcing himself to breathe. "We're leaving," he muttered, but his eyes stayed on the lake. Somewhere deep under that frozen surface, something had moved, and whatever it was calling to him. The next morning dawned clear but bitterly cold, the kind of day when sunlight fooled the skin, but not the bones. The lake stretched out under a hard blue sky, still half frozen, and the wind that came off it smelled of salt and rust. Daniel Hayes stood by his truck, pulling on his gloves, his thoughts heavy with the image of that strange blue light pulsing beneath the ice. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that low hum again, deep and steady, like the heartbeat of something ancient. Ranger circled near the porch, nose down, tail stiff, uneasy since the night before. Daniel decided to drive into town. The tin letters from the box still burned in his mind. HL. And if his guess was right, Harold Linton had once been part of the harbor watch. Duluth's old docks weren't far, just a stretch of weathered piers and empty warehouses along the southern shore. He hadn't been there since he was a boy. Back then, the docks had been alive with engines, gulls, and the clanging of ship bells. Now, most of it was abandoned. He parked near an old bait shop with a faded sign that read, "Earl's Harbor Supplies." The door creaked as he stepped inside, the smell of oil, fish, and salt water mixed with the dry rasp of dust. Behind the counter stood a man well into his 70s, tall but slightly stooped, with a frame that had once been strong. His face was a map of lines carved by wind and years of work at sea. Thick gray hair framed a face where two sharp blue eyes still burned with stubborn life. He wore a heavy wool sweater with frayed cuffs and had a tattoo of an anchor on his left forearm. When Daniel introduced himself, the man's gaze sharpened. Hayes, you said? Mary Hayes's boy? His voice was gravelly, worn from tobacco and sea air. Daniel nodded. You knew her? Knew her? Earl let out a short, rough laugh. Hell, son. Everyone who worked these docks knew Mary. Smart woman. Fixed the Lighthouse radio herself when the Navy boys couldn't. She was good people. Daniel smiled faintly. She never talked much about those days. Earl leaned on the counter, eyes narrowing. I reckon she didn't. There was a lot folks stopped talking about after '85. What happened in '85? Earl hesitated, glancing toward the window where sunlight slanted through grime. They said it was an electrical fire down by the data tunnel near the East Lighthouse. Government came, shut everything down. Nobody ever saw Harold again. Harold Linton, Daniel said quietly. Earl's eyes flicked back to him. So, you know that name. I found letters, Daniel had said, from him to my mother. He warned her about something in the lake, something that waits. Earl's expression darkened. He rubbed a calloused hand over his chin, the sound rough like sandpaper. He wasn't wrong, son. After that fire, the water near the East Lighthouse changed. Fishermen started losing nets, said they could hear tapping under the hulls on calm nights. And when the fog rolled in, sometimes you could see a light glowing under the surface. Daniel felt his throat tighten. You ever see it? Earl nodded slowly. Once. Thought it was a sub at first, but it wasn't moving right. Too smooth, too steady. Looked like the lake itself was breathing. The old man reached under the counter and pulled out a worn leather journal. Its spine cracked. Harold gave me this the week before he disappeared. Told me if anyone ever came asking about the signal, I should give it to them. He slid it across the counter. Looks like that's you. Daniel took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of time in his hands. Thank you, Earl. The old sailor's eyes softened. Your mother was a good woman. Whatever she was part of, I reckon she tried to protect you from it. If you go poking around that lighthouse, take care. The lake's got a memory, and it don't forget debts. That night, snow began again, fine and thin like drifting ash. Daniel parked his truck near the overgrown road that led to the East Lighthouse. Ranger jumped down beside him, tail up, but cautious, breath steaming in the cold. The tower stood against the horizon, a black silhouette crowned by the faint reflection of moonlight. Its windows were broken, and the metal railing around the top hung twisted like a scar. Inside, the air was damp and still. Daniel's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint and rusted machinery. Ranger sniffed the ground, ears turning as he moved deeper inside. Near the center of the floor, half covered by dust, lay a steel hatch. Daniel knelt beside it, brushing away the grime. The hinges were welded shut, but across the metal plate someone had carved words with a sharp tool, rough, uneven letters that read, "Remember the signal, HL." His pulse quickened. Ranger whined softly, pawing at the edge of the hatch. Daniel crouched lower, his fingers tracing the etched letters. There was no mistaking it. Harold had left this message himself. He turned his light around the room, and something glinted faintly on the far wall, a faded emblem of the U.S. Navy, nearly erased by rust. Then came the sound, a faint tapping from somewhere below, slow, deliberate, just like before. Daniel froze. Ranger growled, teeth bared, staring at the hatch. The tapping stopped, then came again. 3 knocks, spaced evenly apart. Daniel's breath caught. Is someone down there? His voice echoed back at him, swallowed by the tower's hollow throat. No answer, just silence, followed by a soft vibration under his boots, like machinery stirring to life after decades of sleep. He backed away slowly, hand tightening on the flashlight. Ranger barked once, sharp and quick. The sound bounced through the empty chamber and died. Daniel's heart hammered as the hatch trembled slightly underfoot, a low, metallic creak rising from below the floor. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything went still. Outside, the lake wind howled, and the light from the moon flickered over the frozen waves. Daniel turned toward the door, his breath shallow, the words of the old sailor echoing in his mind. The lake's got a memory, and it don't forget debts. Behind him, the hatch clicked, once, softly, as if something beneath had just closed its eyes again. The storm came in without warning. One moment the lake was still, glassy under the muted light of dusk, and the next, the horizon vanished behind a wall of snow. The wind screamed around the lighthouse tower, rattling its old iron bones. Daniel Hayes slammed the door shut, his breath visible in the freezing air. He could hear the lake roaring beyond the cliffs, waves cracking against the ice like distant artillery fire. Ranger paced in tight circles near the entrance, fur bristling, uneasy with the rising pressure in the air. Inside, the lighthouse smelled of rust, damp stone, and old oil. The last time Daniel had stood here, the tapping beneath the floor had driven him out into the cold. Now, trapped by the storm, there was nowhere else to go. He tossed a few broken planks into the old furnace near the wall and struck a match. The flames caught weakly, throwing orange light across the peeling walls. He opened Earl's journal, the one Harold Linton had given the old sailor years before disappearing. The handwriting inside was small, uneven, written by a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. One line stood out. If the lake lights up again, the signal will follow the current beneath the tower. The source is not dead, it sleeps. Daniel traced the words with his thumb, feeling the chill of them, as if the paper itself remembered. Ranger suddenly lifted his head, nostrils flaring. The dog's ears twitched toward the center of the room. He moved slowly across the floor, nose pressed low, until he reached the steel hatch, the one carved with the words, "Remember the signal." He began to scratch, sharp claws clicking against the cold metal. Daniel frowned, kneeling beside him. The hatch was sealed tight, its bolts rusted to the floor. He felt along its edges, searching for anything loose. His hand brushed a small depression on the side, hidden under years of grime. He pressed it, and with a metallic groan, the lock disengaged. Dust swirled in the air as he pulled the hatch open. A wave of cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of metal and something older, stale oil and brine. He shone his flashlight down. A narrow staircase spiraled into the dark, the steps slick with frost. Ranger let out a low whine, but didn't hesitate when Daniel began to descend. Each step echoed hollowly, as if the tower itself were listening. The space below was a chamber, circular and low-ceilinged. Old equipment filled the room, radio consoles, tangled wires, rusted control panels. Dust covered everything, but the shapes were unmistakable. Communication systems, naval grade, from the 1980s. On one wall, painted in black letters, were the words, "Property of the U.S. Navy." Beneath them, half covered by peeling paint, someone had scrawled another line by hand. They lied. Daniel crouched beside one of the consoles. A small reel-to-reel recorder sat there, still connected to the wall socket. The label read, "Project Signal, Tape 7. His hands shook, slightly as he pressed the play button. The tape whirred, then crackled to life. For a moment, there was only static. Then, a voice, familiar, soft, trembling with fatigue. It was his mother. "If you're hearing this, Daniel, it means the lake woke up again. They'll tell you it's sonar or weather interference, but it isn't. They're not Navy. They never were. Harold tried to stop them, but they buried the truth beneath the ice. I helped seal the system, but I couldn't destroy it." Daniel froze. Her voice was older than he remembered, weighted with regret. "I know you'll come back one day. You always had your father's stubborn heart. Promise me, Daniel, don't follow the light. It isn't what it seems." The tape clicked, then fell silent. He stared at the recorder, his pulse pounding in his ears. Ranger pressed close to him, tail low, eyes fixed on the far wall. A faint vibration thrummed under the floor, steady and rising. The machines around them, dead for decades, began to hum. Tiny red lights flickered on the panels, weak but alive. Daniel backed up slowly. "That's impossible," he whispered. Outside, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. A deep, resonant note, like a foghorn but lower, vibrating through the stone. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. Daniel ran up the steps, pulling the hatch closed behind them. The light from the fire had dimmed, shadows crawling up the walls. He crossed to the window and froze. The lake was alive again. A ribbon of light wound beneath the ice, glowing pale blue and moving fast, cutting through the frozen surface like veins beneath translucent skin. It stretched from the horizon toward the lighthouse, pulsing in rhythm with the hum below their feet. Ranger growled, stepping in front of him, body tense, hackles raised. The beam reached the shoreline and stopped, right beneath the tower. For a moment, everything went still. Then the ground trembled. The old machinery below began to roar, gears turning, signals crackling through unseen circuits. The recorder on the table clicked by itself, spinning without power. From outside came a new sound, clearer this time. A voice, faint but human, carried through the wind. Daniel's heart stuttered. It was his mother's voice again. Remember the signal. Then, just as suddenly, the light vanished. The hum stopped. Silence fell so heavy it felt alive. Daniel dropped into a chair, staring at the dark window. "Mom," he whispered. His voice barely broke the quiet. Ranger rested his head on Daniel's knee, eyes never leaving the window. The storm still raged outside, but somewhere beneath the lake's frozen skin, something had stirred, and now it knew he was listening. When the storm finally broke, silence fell heavy over Lake Superior. The wind eased to a whisper, and thin light began to seep through the cracks of the lighthouse windows. Daniel Hayes woke on the cold floor beside the extinguished fire, his body stiff, every joint aching. Ranger lay beside him, chest rising and falling in shallow, tired breaths. The dog's fur was damp with frost, but his eyes opened when Daniel stirred, soft and loyal as ever. "We made it," Daniel murmured, his voice hoarse. The machines below had fallen silent, the humming, the trembling, gone. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a fever dream. He sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his shoulder. The radio console across the room flickered weakly, its screen pulsing with one word repeated again and again: reboot. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. The tape recorder still sat where he had left it, a thin line of frost tracing the edges of its reels. His mother's voice echoed faintly in his memory, warm but resolute. "If you hear this, it means the lake woke up again." He rose and crossed to the console. Ranger followed, limping slightly, his paw raw from scratching at the metal hatch during the storm. Daniel crouched beside him, checking the wound. "You're tougher than me, buddy," he said softly. Ranger leaned his head into Daniel's arm, tail giving a single, slow wag. Outside, the light was returning, a soft gold washing through the thinning clouds. Daniel hesitated before pressing the restart switch on the console. A low hum filled the room, rising and falling like the inhale of something immense. The system lights flared one by one, steady and warm this time, not blue, not cold, but a clean amber glow. A quiet chime sounded, followed by the mechanical grind of gears deep within the tower. The lighthouse light turned. For the first time in 40 years, it came alive again. He climbed to the upper level, boots echoing on the spiral steps. The lantern room was coated with dust. The great Fresnel lens cracked along one edge. Still, the light that filled it was golden, steady, reaching across the snow-laden landscape and spilling onto the frozen lake like a promise. Daniel rested his hands on the railing, his breath visible in the cool air. Below him, Ranger barked once, as if sensing something shift inside his owner's chest. From the shore, faint figures began to gather, people from Duluth, wrapped in heavy coats, pointing up at the glowing tower. They must have thought someone had repaired the old lighthouse at last. Among them, Daniel spotted a familiar face. Sarah Milton, his mother's former neighbor, trudged through the snow toward the base of the cliff. She was still tall and graceful in her plain wool coat, her silver-streaked hair pinned beneath a thick cap. When she reached the door, she called out, her voice half lost to the wind. "Daniel, are you up there?" He came down the stairs and opened the door, the warm light spilling out behind him. Sarah looked at him with tears shining in her eyes. "You got it working again," she said softly. Mary would have been proud. Daniel's throat tightened. "I didn't fix it. It fixed itself." Sarah smiled faintly, her gaze drifting past him toward the steady beam turning above. Maybe she had a hand in that. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, letting her come in from the cold. She brushed snow from her coat, her movement slow but sure. Her hands, thin and lined, touched the wall with familiarity. "I used to bring her here, you know," she said. "Your mother. After Harold disappeared, she'd sit here for hours, staring at the lake. Said she could still hear the machines humming under the ice." Daniel glanced toward the hatch. She was right. Sarah met his eyes, and for a moment she saw something there, a flicker of peace where only grief had lived before. "You look like her when you say that," she murmured. Ranger padded up and leaned against Sarah's leg. She bent to scratch behind his ear, her smile trembling. "And you must be the brave one, huh?" When she left, the sun had climbed higher, cutting through the last of the clouds. Daniel returned to the console and looked at the readings. The system showed no data, no coordinates, just a single message at the bottom of the screen. Signal terminated, restored manual control. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in the chair. "She shut it down for good," he whispered, "and somehow she let me see it one last time." That spring, the ice melted earlier than usual. The lake took on a brighter color, clear and glassy, the air sharp with the scent of thawing pine. Daniel stayed. He rebuilt the small keeper's quarters beside the tower and took the title of Lightkeeper himself. Ranger, stronger again, spent the days patrolling the rocky shore, barking at gulls and greeting fishermen who ventured close. By summer, Daniel had turned the lower rooms into a small training center for rescue dogs. He worked with local volunteers, teaching them search and rescue techniques. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, but it was the one he'd needed. Each night, as the sun dipped behind the far ridge, he climbed to the top of the tower and lit the beam himself, watching it stretch across the lake in gold. And sometimes, when the air was very still, he heard it again. Not the hum from the machines, but a voice soft as the wind itself, carried through the glass. "The signal never dies," his mother whispered. "Not while you still believe." Daniel closed his eyes, the corners of his mouth lifting in a quiet smile. "I believe, Mom," he said. "I believe." As the golden beam stretched across the thawing lake and faded into the horizon, Daniel finally understood that the light was more than a machine. It was a promise. His mother's voice, carried through storm and silence, had not been a warning of fear, but a message of faith. Sometimes, miracles do not appear in grand moments of revelation, but in quiet endurance, the strength to believe when all signs say you shouldn't. The storm that nearly took his life also gave him clarity, that no matter how deep the darkness or how long the winter, the light always returns. And maybe, just maybe, that light is God's way of whispering, "You were never truly alone." So, when you face your own nights, when the world feels frozen and silent, remember Daniel's story. Remember the light that came back not through power, but through belief. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to tell us what moment of light you've seen in your own life. And if you believe, as Daniel did, that faith can turn storms into blessings, subscribe to our channel so more hearts can find warmth in stories like this. May the Lord bless you and keep you safe. May His light guide you through every storm, and may you always find the courage to believe when the night feels longest.